What if the fat around your organs, the kind you cannot see or pinch, responds to a completely different set of signals than regular body fat, and a set of daily habits practiced in Japan for generations happens to be almost perfectly designed to target it? Japan has one of the lowest rates of visceral fat accumulation in the world, not because of extreme diets or intense exercise programs, but because of a few specific daily habits that quietly change the hormonal environment where visceral fat lives and grows. If you have lost weight before, maybe even significant weight, but the belly area seemed to barely move, you already know this specific frustration. The scale goes down, the face gets thinner, but the midsection stays stubborn in a way nothing else does. Maybe you tried cutting carbs, doing more cardio, or focusing specifically on core exercises. Each approach worked a little somewhere, but the deep belly stayed as if it were playing by a completely different set of rules. And the confusing part is that visceral fat does not even look like what most people picture. Some people carrying significant visceral fat look relatively normal from the outside. It sits deep around your organs, invisible and stubborn. But here is the part almost nobody explains. Visceral fat is not just fat stored in an inconvenient location. It is a biologically distinct type of fat that behaves differently, responds to different signals, and requires a different approach to actually move it. Here is exactly why. James is 44, reasonably active, and has spent the past 2 years managing his diet carefully enough to lose about 15 pounds. His clothes fit better almost everywhere, but the belly area remains stubbornly unchanged throughout. He tried intermittent fasting, reduced his calorie intake, and added 2 gym sessions a week. He was consistent and patient. The overall results were real, but the one area he most wanted to change seemed to be responding to none of it. A colleague mentioned that people in Japan seem to carry much less of this specific type of fat, and that it had less to do with eating less and more to do with how and when they ate. James decided to look into it. But here is what almost nobody realizes. Visceral fat has significantly more cortisol receptors and insulin receptors than the fat sitting just under your skin. This means it responds more aggressively to both elevated insulin and elevated stress hormones than any other fat in your body. That sensitivity is invisible. There's no feeling that specifically says visceral fat is accumulating. It just quietly builds when insulin stays elevated or cortisol stays chronically high, 2 things that are completely normal in most modern daily routines. Most modern eating habits create exactly the right conditions for visceral fat to grow. Large meals eaten quickly, frequent blood sugar spikes from processed foods, and the low-grade chronic stress of a busy lifestyle all hit visceral fat-specific receptors directly. And this is where it gets interesting. The Japanese daily habits that correlate with low visceral fat rates are not calorie restriction programs or intense exercise plans. They are specific low-effort behaviors that directly address insulin and cortisol, the 2 hormones visceral fat responds to most. The first mechanism is what happens to blood sugar immediately after eating. Every time you eat a meal, glucose enters your blood, insulin rises to manage it, and during that elevated insulin window, visceral fat cells are actively receiving a signal to store. The faster blood sugar rises after a meal, the more insulin is required, and the longer the visceral fat storage window stays open. Anything that slows the rise without reducing the meal itself directly reduces how long visceral fat receives that store signal. The second mechanism is cortisol. Visceral fat cells near the abdominal organs have a higher density of cortisol receptors than subcutaneous fat. When cortisol stays elevated for extended periods, visceral fat cells receive a preferential signal to accumulate. Together, elevated insulin after meals and chronically elevated cortisol from stress create exactly the hormonal environment where visceral fat is most likely to build over time, independent of how many total calories you are consuming. Stay with me here because this is where the Japanese habits become specific. A 10-minute walk taken within 30 minutes of finishing a meal does something measurable to blood sugar that nothing else you could do at that moment comes close to matching. Light movement, specifically walking, activates muscle cells to absorb glucose directly without requiring insulin to open the door. This happens during the post-meal window and can reduce the blood sugar spike from that meal by 20 to 30%. Smaller spikes mean less insulin is released. Less insulin means the visceral fat storage window is shorter and less intense after every meal. Over days and weeks, this compounds into a meaningfully different hormonal environment around visceral fat cells. The second Japanese habit is green tea, consumed regularly as a daily drink. Green tea contains compounds called catechins, specifically EGCG, that have been shown to preferentially increase fat oxidation in visceral tissue when consumed consistently. Think of it like two separate levers being pulled at the same time. The post-meal walk reduces how much visceral fat accumulates after each meal. The green tea increases how much visceral fat is broken down between meals. Both levers working together create a compound effect. The modern habit that works most directly against this is eating fast. Most people finish a meal in under 10 minutes. Eating quickly means the full glucose load hits the bloodstream in a single fast wave, maximizing the insulin spike and visceral fat storage window. Sitting completely still for 1 to 3 hours after eating is the second habit. No movement means no muscle glucose absorption, so the entire blood sugar response is managed by insulin alone, keeping the visceral fat storage signal elevated for as long as possible. Large portions eaten in one sitting create a larger glucose surge than the same food eaten more slowly or in smaller amounts. The body cannot absorb fast enough. Insulin rises higher, and the visceral storage window is both larger and longer as a result. Chronic low-grade stress, the kind that lives in the background from deadlines, screens, and constant notifications, keeps cortisol slightly elevated for most of the day. Over months and years, that low but persistent cortisol signal is one of the most reliable drivers of visceral fat accumulation. And none of these feel extreme. Eating at your desk while working, skipping a post-meal walk, drinking coffee instead of green tea, these are all completely normal habits, but there is a way to shift them without overhauling your entire daily routine. Here's the reframe. Visceral fat is not stubborn because your body is broken or because you are not trying hard enough. It is stubborn because it responds to hormonal signals, and most modern daily habits happen to send exactly the wrong signals consistently. But visceral fat is also one of the most metabolically active fat types in the body, which means it responds faster than subcutaneous fat when the right signals are present. Change the hormonal environment consistently, and it moves relatively quickly. The Japanese method does not work because of genetics or dramatically fewer calories. It works because the specific daily habits consistently lower the two hormonal signals that visceral fat responds to most, and it does so without any dramatic lifestyle overhaul. If you have been targeting belly fat and not seeing it move, it is very likely not a calorie problem. It is a hormonal signal problem, and the signals are adjustable with habits you can start today without any dramatic changes to what you eat. The first habit is a 10-minute walk within 30 minutes of finishing any meal, especially lunch and dinner. It does not need to be fast. The movement itself activates muscle glucose absorption and flattens the post-meal blood sugar curve. The second habit is replacing one daily coffee or sugary drink with plain green tea, ideally with no added sugar. The catechins are most effective when consumed regularly and without sweeteners that would raise insulin and cancel out the effect. The third habit is slowing down your eating pace. A simple approach is putting your fork down between bites or aiming for meals that take at least 15 to 20 minutes. This alone reduces the peak blood sugar spike from most meals by stretching the glucose release window. Used together, these three habits address both hormonal levers simultaneously. The walk and slower eating reduce accumulation after meals. The green tea increases release between meals. Most people see measurable change at the waist within 4 to 6 weeks of consistency. Think of visceral fat like a sponge soaked in water. Under normal conditions, it holds everything it absorbs, but introduce a consistent squeeze, lower insulin, and less cortisol, and it begins releasing what it was holding much more readily. The post-meal walk is that squeeze applied directly after every meal. Instead of letting the full insulin wave reach visceral fat as a storage signal, the walk intercepts some of that glucose before insulin has to handle it, reducing the storage signal each time. Or think of green tea catechins like a key that opens a lock on visceral fat cells, specifically encouraging them to release stored energy for fuel during the low insulin periods between meals. Not magic, just biochemistry operating consistently over time. Once you see visceral fat this way, not as a calorie problem but as a hormonal signal problem, the Japanese habits make immediate sense. And no, this does not require perfection. 3 meals a day, 3 short walks, 2 or 3 cups of green tea, that is the framework. The first step is picking one meal today and taking a 10-minute walk within 30 minutes of finishing it. The second step is replacing one drink tomorrow with plain green tea, no sugar, and doing both again the next day. Watch for 2 signs it is working: a reduction in the tight or bloated feeling around the midsection within the first 2 weeks, and a gradual shift in how clothes fit at the waist over 4 to 6 weeks. Missing a day means simply picking up at the next meal. James added the post-meal walk, switched one coffee to green tea, and started eating without his phone, which naturally slowed his pace. 6 weeks later, the waist measurement that had not moved in 2 years had dropped by nearly 2 inches. This is not a shortcut, and it is not magic. Visceral fat built over years takes consistent weeks to move, but because of its high metabolic activity, it responds to the right signals faster than most people expect. Consistency is the entire mechanism. After your next meal today, set a timer for 30 minutes and take a 10-minute walk. That is the only starting point you need. Everything else builds from that one repeated habit, one meal at a time. Visceral fat responds to signals, not just willpower. Now that you know which signals matter and how to send them, the process your body already has in place to release that fat can actually run the way it was designed to.